So we're delighted to be here today celebrating 50 years of connections that we've helped to foster across New Jersey with two of our friends and champions, Christopher Fisher and Stanley Katz. The New Jersey Council for the Humanities is a 501c3 nonprofit and the statewide partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we work across New Jersey to support and promote community-based collective exploration of our histories, values, cultures, and beliefs. To say a few more words about our organization, I'd like to introduce NJCH Board Chair Dan Fatton. Dan?
Thank you, Karen, and good evening, folks. I'd like to echo Karen's words of welcome. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the New Jersey Council for Humanities, I want to encourage you to check out our website, njhumanities.org, and look at other ways you might get involved. When you do, I think you'll find that NJCH has been extremely busy over the last year, helping to award more than $1 million in federal funding to local nonprofits in order to help the cultural sector recover from COVID and adapt for a more resilient future. But for right now, I just want to encourage all of you to consider supporting the council if you can, to thank my fellow board members, and I see there are several of us on tonight, as well as the alumni of the board who are in attendance, and thank our speakers tonight. I want to let you know how proud we are to bring the humanities to all corners of New Jersey. And we're looking forward to celebrating the public humanities all year long, and especially to awarding the council's new prize, bearing the name of our featured speaker, Stanley Katz, to one of the excellent New Jersey organizations doing public humanities in the state. Karen, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Dan. We're really lucky and grateful to have such a wonderful board and set of friends and partners at NJCH. But for tonight, I want to cover a couple of quick logistical details as quickly as possible and then introduce our speakers. We anticipate that this is going to be kind of an informal conversation, and that's the vibe I hope you were getting when you showed up and we were all chatting already. So if you have questions, I would encourage you to type them into the chat. I'll flag for Chris that there's a question and we'll go ahead and try to address those. Otherwise, if you want to keep your microphone on mute, that would be helpful. And this recording will be available after the program. Tonight's event will feature Christopher Fisher, who is a history professor at TCNJ and is the current vice chair of NJCH's Board of Trustees. Chris has been really involved with NJCH for a long time, and we've really benefited from some of his own public scholarship, as well as his willingness to jump in on events like this and help the council out. Chris earned his doctorate at Rutgers University and has both published and taught extensively on 20th century American diplomacy, the Cold War, and race politics in the United States. And Chris is going to be speaking tonight with Stan Katz. Stan spent most of his career teaching at Princeton, where he was and still is beloved by students and colleagues. His contributions to the scholarly community also include those made, though, during his 11 years as president of the American Council of Learned Societies. He's an elected fellow of several of the most significant scholarly organizations in the United States and internationally. And of course, he devoted 37 years to the board of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, many of those as vice chair or chair. In each of these roles, Stan was a passionate and unwavering advocate for the public humanities, and for his contributions as a brilliant scholar, teacher, advocate, and public historian, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal, the capstone of an exceptional career, by President Barack Obama in 2011. Tonight, he and Chris will be reflecting on that pursuit to which Stan is most committed, the teaching of democracy, as well as on the expansion of cultural endeavors in New Jersey and the United States, on NJCH and its growth, and on what Stan thinks lies ahead for the public humanities. I know them both well enough to say that the next hour will be a great deal of fun. So thank you, and go ahead and take it away, Chris.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank everyone for being here. Stan, this is going to be fun. You know, when every historian imagines doing this job and being a part of this profession, I think we would all dream of having your experience. Going to Harvard, studying with Bernard Bailyn, going to Wisconsin. Oh, it's just an amazing story of how you've been present at the creation of so many things. One of the things that I thought we would start by talking about is the creation of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Could you talk a little bit about its origins and how it's situated in the overall project of the public humanities?
Great. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, by the way, to Karen and to the council. I'm very honored by all of this. And as you know, very committed to it. There are only one or two people on this call whose memories go back as far as mine does. Arnita Jones is here. And she's one of maybe the only one whose memory goes back as far as mine. But, we got going on our careers. I got going on my career long before there was a National Endowment for the Humanities. And I've made the argument in print that probably the year 1965 was the only year in modern American history at which an institution like NEH could have been founded. I'm not going to take the time to spell that out now, but I really think it was the coincidence of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the accidental presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the opportunity that Johnson seized to institutionalize liberalism in the national government that made all of this possible. The idea had been out there in one form or another before, but it really wasn't possible to act on it. It was an idea that had been pushed mainly by scholarly organizations, and as some of you will know, it really was a consortium of scholarly organizations, primarily ACLS, Phi Beta Kappa, and the Council of Graduate Schools that combined to actually make a formal proposal for all of this. But the formal proposal wouldn't have gone anywhere unless the political situation had been congenial to the legislation that did take place in 1965. And so they set up a National Foundation for the Arts and Humanities. All of that, by the way, we can talk about later, possibly is interesting. It was the arts and the humanities. And of course, it was two separate institutions that I think, analytically and probably politically may have been a mistake, but in any case, that's the way they decided to do it. We were left then with two separate endowments. There have been times when that has been a protection for those of us in the humanities because NEA, the Arts Endowment, has always been the juicier target for people, particularly on the right. And I think actually we were the accidental beneficiaries of that. At other times, however, the legislative process was much more congenial to providing money for the arts. And we hooked on to the coattails of the arts in order to raise our budget to a commensurate level. But in any case, the organization was founded then, and it was very generally intended in the language that they used in the act, and there's not enough time to go through it, but to give a democratic justification for public expenditures to support the arts and humanities. And in section 2 of the legislation, they run through all of this. And, if you read it carefully, it's enough to make you a little queasy, I would say. The arts and humanities belong to all the people of the United States, yes. And it's very platitudinous, to say the least. But it's there because they were struggling, actually. What's interesting about it is they felt the need to justify public expenditure to support the arts and humanities. Wasn't it all obvious? So these are the kind of stock responses of the mid-20th century to the question of why should the public do this? And of course, as we're saying right here, that the United States may have been the only country, certainly one of the few countries in the world at that time, where you had to explain why the public should be supporting essentially academic work in these fields, or primarily academic work in these fields. But here in the States we did, and it was because of the tremendous sort of tradition and commitment that we have to private action in the United States. So the default in our country has always been that the private sector ought to do it. And you have to make an affirmative case for the public to do it. Now, we could talk a lot about that, but I mean, I think that's the basic dynamic that we're talking about here. And the key problem is the one that's referred to in Section 4, or Article 4 of Section 2 of the legislation. And it says simply, democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. Now, that's just a translation from Jefferson. So this is the Jeffersonian rationale for education and democracy. And it's part of the strength of our tradition and of our sector, but it's also our weakness, isn't it? Because the way Jefferson phrased it is liable to the interpretation. And Paul Finkelman is watching this. I promise not to use the S word here. But it's open to the interpretation that it's an elitist understanding of democracy. And without saying much about Jefferson, you can understand that the kind of citizen he had in mind was a white, propertied, free citizen. And a lot of things flowed from that. Now, obviously, we're in a different environment now completely. But it is, I think, a perception that has dogged this activity for many, many years. I'm not going to go on all this, but I mean, that is the origin. It's a kind of political miracle that the legislation should have passed. And then the question was, apart from this platitudinous legislation, and it certainly is platitudinous, how would you institutionalize it? What would you do? And I think it's fair to say that they didn't really have a clue. And it was like all new federal institutions, you set up a structure and you hope that some wise and smart people will figure out how to make it happen. And that's what they did. And of course, they turned initially to your, stock academic types. And so Barnaby Keeney and people like that, a lot of very traditional and very establishmentarian types were asked what to do about this. They were almost entirely academics, and they had an academic view of what the humanities were. And by the way, one of the key things for us, and we've all discussed this on the council, is that they didn't know how to define the humanities. And they never have defined the humanities. So we get this long list of academic fields, which I think doesn't accumulate to a definition. So that even now, it's impossible for the government to say what it means by the humanities. And it's a challenge for Karen and those of you on the council to explain what it is that we do mean by all of that. But okay, so that was the problem, and they set it off. And initially, it did more for academic and established institutional constituencies than for anyone else. But from the very start, and this is the key point here, there was a feeling that it had to serve the public and that it had to serve the non-academic public, although nobody knew exactly how to operationalize that. But it didn't take very long at all, just a couple of years, to come up with the notion that at least one of the ways to do that would be to establish councils in each of the states in order to specify who potential grantees and purposes might be in the 50 states and ultimately in the territories as well as the states. So that actually begins in the very early 1970s, begins in 69 from one point of view. But from, let's say, 1969 to 72, they institutionalized the commitment to investment in what we now call state councils. And the idea was that some significant portion of the NIH budget should go to that and should be passed along directly to the states. So we could talk about that, but that was, I would call it a federalist impulse. It was there almost from the very start.
Yeah, I was hoping that we could
Go
sort
ahead.
of drill down a little bit deeper on that. In particular, talking about New Jersey, I think it's interesting that you said that, you know, having this sort of large idea of the national humanities sort of put out there, right, in policy, but not knowing how to actualize it, how to operationalize it, and when doing so, doing so in a way that's very elitist. Of course, histories were already taking place in local communities. People were already doing the work of capturing local stories and local histories. And that's where I think what you're talking about now, particularly in the case of New Jersey, is important, particularly for this crowd. What would you say about this idea of the public humanities intersecting with the work that was being done in creating the national humanities? Could you talk a little bit about that, and then talk about it in the context of New Jersey and New Jersey's Council for the Humanities?
Sure, Chris. Well, first, I mean, I think the initial instinct was political. That is, it was a feeling that you know, culture can't emanate from Washington, D.C. The culture belongs to people, and it belongs to people where they live. And this is a kind of anti-federalist instinct that has never left American politics or American political thought. And I think it's a recognition of that and a fear that a centrally driven agenda for the humanities or for the arts is something that has to be treated with care. That's a possibly controversial and divisive idea. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is a sort of a genuine federalism, a feeling that after all, the core of American life is in the periphery, that it's where the people live. And again, this is an idea that goes back to our origins. So I think that it's that kind of instinct there. And it was intended to do one thing and it did another. And it was intended to give a creative and programmatic capacity to the periphery, to the states. It was also intended, and this has worked, I think, splendidly, to develop political support for the central organization. As those of you, and probably most of the people on this call who have visited House or Senate offices on the Hill know, the first thing we say when we go into a senator's office is we pull our list of grants to Idaho and explain what the endowment has done in Idaho. That's always meaningful to a senator or to a congressperson. And that part of it has really worked very well. So it's got a double-barreled function. On the other hand, the states aren't all created equal when it comes to activities like this. And from this point of view, crudely speaking, I would say there are the rich states and the poor states. And the rich states are those states that think it's a public responsibility for the state to support local humanities or arts activities. And the poor states, and I think New Jersey is a poster child for the poor states, don't think it's a good idea. Don't feel the responsibility of the state to support the arts and humanities, and are quite happy to pass that along to the federal government. And what that has meant most of the time in the history of the council in New Jersey is that we have been, whether or not we've been happy with it, we have been content to re-grant the funds granted to us by the National Endowment. It's after all a substantial amount, and it's been enough to sustain programs for, for more than a half a century. But until recently, and with few exceptions, the state of New Jersey has invested very little. And there was a brief period when Leonard Lance was in the Senate, when we got funding from the state of New Jersey. Now we're getting funding again. But if you compare us to a state like, let's say, Minnesota or Virginia, where there is continuous and substantial funding over a long period of time, those states can simply do things we can't do. But it's also true, there's another problem here, and that is that New Jersey's had a harder time amassing resources than many other states. I attended a meeting, the annual meeting of the Idaho State Council some years ago, and I was just stunned. They had a meeting in Boise in a big ballroom, and there were wealthy people from all over the state and lots of state representatives and the congressional representatives. They raised a ton of money, and you simply couldn't do that in New Jersey. You could give a party like that, but these people wouldn't come. And that's a problem, and it's a problem we've had. Now, I don't want to say much about that, but I will say this, that I think it was, Benjamin Franklin, who as usual had it right. Franklin, you'll remember, described New Jersey as a keg bunged at both ends. And what he meant by that was that it was New York at one end and Philadelphia at the other. That's still the case. And, this state looks to many people like a meld of suburban New York and suburban Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. So it's been a problem for us. There, by and large, aren't large philanthropic foundations in New Jersey. And many of the people who are terribly wealthy do have primary loyalties either in Philadelphia or New York. There are all kinds of problems that we confront. It's not unique. When Brianne was with us, and she's on this call, we talked about this. Connecticut is a very similar state. You really got New York at one end and Boston at the other end. And it's a big commuter state, just as New Jersey is a big commuter state. So in a crude way, that has been a problem. It has made it very hard for us to generate local funding for what we do.
So then the New Jersey Council for the Humanities represents an opportunity to do two things, a unique opportunity. One, to reinvest New Jerseyans in their own state, in their own story, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Claiming these histories, but also to grab the reins on the question of what makes a democracy and citizens in a democracy. And I wanted to just, before we move on, to talk more about that in your work, as you said, as a teacher of democracy. I want to know if anybody in the audience had a question on these early years of the Endowment for the Humanities or the councils that they wanted to ask before we moved on.
I have a question from the audience on democracy broadly, so maybe that could be our transition point.
Perfect.
So Mike Klein, if you don't mind me saying, it was you who posted and wants to know if Stan has a read on this idea that we might in fact be suspended between democracy and autocracy at the moment. There's a David Remnick piece in the New Yorker that Mike refers to that argues that for the first time in 200 years, we're suspended between democracy and autocracy. There's a new book called When Civil Wars Start by Barbara Walter at UCSD, which is described in that article. Are things really that bad? Putting this together with the current fight to protect voting rights, everything that's going on in our democracy today, and of course, what we're reflecting on from just over a year ago now, where do we sit in terms of this crucial idea that you've devoted your life to teaching?
Sure. Well, we could spend the rest of the time on that question. Let me say just a couple of things. I don't think the sky is falling. I think we're in a terrible place. And I think that the general political situation is horrible. But I don't think it's unique in American history. And I don't feel as though there's no way out of this. I do think there are lots of ways out of it. And I think the Barbara Walter book has gotten much more attention than it deserves. I think, frankly, that's fairly crude political science, and she could do with knowing more history than she knows. Having said that, I would have given a different answer to this question on January 4th, 2021. My world, like everybody's world, changed on January 6th. I didn't think that could happen. And January 6th last year was one of the worst days of my life. But I think I have taken many deep breaths since then. And I feel as though not just the institutions are sturdy enough to respond, but I think the underlying spirit of democracy and of civil society is strong enough that in the end we're going to pull through, although we all know it's going to be difficult. I think it's why what we're all doing as humanists and as public humanists is so desperately important. That is to say, we have to assist, strengthen the spine, identify the people who really can speak out and act in useful kinds of ways at a moment of crisis. But after all, our democracy has been through periodic challenges of this kind. The Civil War was worse than this by a lot. And I don't think there's going to be, I think Barbara Walter's wrong. I don't think there's any threat of civil war right now. But there is a threat of bad political outcomes for a long period of time and in bad ways. Many of you saw the Supreme Court decision about an hour or two ago, which I think was entirely predictable. But it's not the end of the world. And the Republic will survive it. And, you know, in the end, Franklin was right again. It's a republic if you can keep it.
Yeah.
And so what I take it he was saying was that nobody's going to hand it to us on a platter. It's an act of will, it's an act of participation. And our job as humanists is to identify what needs to be done, identify the ways in which it might be done, and to engage the population in serious thought and discussion of those kinds of things. That's a kind of simple-minded answer.
Stan, I'm heartened by the faith that you have in democracy, and it speaks to your career. And I was hoping that we could talk a little bit more about that, talk about your career, as I said before, as a teacher of democracy. Particularly, you know, given your origins, right? As you told me, you started as someone who wanted to study 17th century English society. How does a person go from doing that to being engaged in this conversation about the public humanities and democracy in America?
Well, the short answer to that is to have had to confront Ann Gordon as a student. So one of the people who put my feet to the fire very early in this. No, I fell in love with the history of the 17th century in England because when I was an undergraduate, because it seemed to me it was the root of the notion of modernity in the modern world. And I was curious as to how we became modern. And so I applied to graduate school to do a PhD in Tudor and Stuart history. And I told Chris this story, and the short version was simply that as I began thinking about it, I was thinking about, you know, why did I want to go to graduate school? My father put my feet to the fire on that one. He thought it was a silly idea. He thought I should take over his business, or failing that, I should go to law school. In other words, do something useful and profitable. Maybe that was right. But in any case, I wasn't interested. And I was interested in ideas. And I thought, well, I'm a very lucky fellow. By the way, some of you know this. I mean, I think I'm the luckiest person who ever lived throughout my life. I've had nothing but good choices. But at that point, I could afford to go to graduate school. And I decided good. And the reason I wanted to go was that I had a strong sense, starting from when I think I was a sophomore in college, that I wanted to be a teacher. And I originally wanted to be a high school teacher, but I looked in the mirror and I said to myself, Stan, you are not tough enough to be a high school teacher. And I think that was right. So I had the intuition, absolutely correct. It turned out that it was a lot easier to be a professor. And I decided I would take the easy way out, so graduate school. But as I was thinking over that summer before graduate school began, about what I was about to do, it dawned on me that the reason I wanted to do this was that I wanted to be a teacher. And what did I want to teach? Well, it would be nice to teach Stuart history. I was fascinated by Stuart history, but that isn't why I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be a teacher because I thought it was an opportunity that I had had to become a democratic citizen. And this is the way we have in this country of institutionalizing democracy in new generations. And so that said to me, well, if that was my aim as a college teacher, I probably was better off teaching American history than English history. And so I made that decision that converged, as I told Chris, with the discovery that this smart young kid had just started to teach at Harvard. His name was Bernard Balin. Nobody had ever heard of him, but I had a cup of coffee with him. And it was immediately apparently to me that this was the smartest person I'd ever met. So I signed up. And his field was early American history. Well, then I thought about it for a moment. And I thought, wow, I can have it both ways. I can teach early American history. That's American history. But I can study England in the 17th century. I just have to look at the colonies. So that's what got me going. And so that's how I, wound up in the field that I did. I'll say only one other thing about that. My commitment to that has never wavered. And it has helped me to keep changing my field because, as many of you know, I really haven't taught early American history, since I was at Wisconsin. And I left Wisconsin in 1971. So that's a long time ago. So I've moved into other fields, and primarily, legal history initially, then now the history of philanthropy. And because these were things that fit into my agenda of teaching about democracy, but understanding democracy, understanding how it works in the modern world. That has always been my goal. And that has meant that it was not so hard for me to keep sort of intellectually transforming myself. And by the way, this is advice I give to students. In my old office, I moved to a new office. I had a wall covered with stickies with sentiments that I wanted to point out to students. And the most important one was contributed by the greatest American philosopher. You'll all recognize that as Yogi Berra. And Yogi said, well, the most profound thing Yogi ever said was, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. There you are.
All right. Well, listen, we have a question, I think, right, Karin?
We have a couple of questions now.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and we're a small enough group. Maybe I should just call on the people who wrote them in and they can read them for themselves.
Sure.
I'm going to preface this by warning Stan, your audience is not as optimistic as you are. So with that warning in place, maybe Dan and then Howard, could you guys share your questions with the group? And then maybe Stan, you can,
sure.
We're both coming from a fairly negative place, so you can try to buoy us all after that.
Okay.
Great. Go ahead.
Thanks, Karin. I was hoping that we might talk a little bit more about the sort of state of discourse and just that we're thinking about these threats against democracy, but it's partly driven by the growth of social media and this sort of promulgation of disinformation. And just how does I guess I'm more skeptical than you are, and it's nice to hear your optimism, but how does democracy survive if we don't really share a common understanding of facts or reality? And just wondering if you could talk more about the current state of affairs from that perspective.
Sure. Do you want to take Mike too?
Sorry,
Karin?
let's take Howard. Howard, do you want to read yours
Howard.
out as well?
Sorry.
They're slightly separate directions, but maybe you can find a way to straddle them.
Okay.
Okay, this is Howard. Thanks, Stan. I guess my question is, I'm feeling pretty pessimistic about the state of higher education right now. And I'm worried about how robust the contribution from higher ed will be in the democratizing project that you're describing.
Okay. Well, let me take them sequentially then. Two difficult questions. Dan, I don't think democracy is broken. I think the political system is broken. And that's bad, but I don't think that's terminal. And that's really the question. It's going to relate to the second thing, but the question is, the technology has made it more difficult, to be sure. The transformation of the media creates all kinds of challenges. But again, the history of the United States is replete with problems of this kind. Go back to the first decade. I would argue that the press in America has never been worse than it was in the 1790s. And talk about disregard for facts. The Federalists didn't believe in facts, and Thomas Jefferson didn't believe in facts when it came to read the stuff that was published in the daily press in those years. It was horrible, just horrible. We worked our way through that, and I could point you to take again the end of the 19th century. Yellow journalism, after all, goes back mainly 100 years after the period I'm just talking about now, the very end of the 19th century. It was pretty bad. It was horrible. And you could buy your own truth in the press. So I think we've been doing this for a long time. The technology makes it a lot worse because it means that everybody owns a printing press now. That's new, and that's horrible. And it's a problem, and we don't know how to control that. And it's going to take a long time. On the other hand, there are, I think, a lot of good things happening. I was looking today, just reading the New York Times, at this new, I don't remember what they're calling it, but there's a new website, a not-for-profit journalism website, that's going to be organized not on individual news stories, but on clusters of stories about important things that have happened in the recent past. That's great. So a lot of good information, better information is now available. So, and I think there's going to be a dynamic between the bad information and the false information and the good information. And, I'm very old-fashioned when it comes to these questions. I really think the answer to bad speech is more speech. And that's, I suppose, an act of faith, and you may not share it. But, let me just say only this about that. I really became an adult during the McCarthy era. That was a moment when speech was as poisonous as it has been at any time in American history since the 1790s, I would say. It was awful. And by the way, I have been the victim politically of red baiting over the second half of my career. On many occasions, I've lost jobs because of that. Fine. We survive those things, and we will survive. I think we will. It is an act of faith. It shouldn't be underestimated, I would say, but I wouldn't lose hope about it. So let me then turn to Howard's question. Now I got to get back to Howard's question. Howard, give me the punchline.
are the universities going to be able to help us or not?
Okay, right. Okay, so that's a different kind of question entirely. I'm actually more pessimistic about that than I am about Dan's question. I think the universities are not doing a great job of responding to the variety of crises that we confront right now. And I'm hopeful that we can do better. Every once in a while, there's good news. There was good news today. I saw the name of the new president of the University of Pennsylvania. It's a great choice, I think. She's one of the most intelligent and articulate, and I think enlightened people I know. So some institutions are making good choices. But the real problem is the one I think that was identified in a book by a Canadian scholar about 20 years ago, and that was the decline of universities. And he thought the reason was that he never used the word neoliberalism, but basically that the universities had sold out to neoliberalism, and that he called it had become the University of Excellence. And excellence was not a positive word for him. It really meant mean-spirited utilitarian. And I do think that is the problem that confronts us now. And in our little patch of the woods, the danger is a focus on STEM education to the neglect of humanistic education and artistic education. I think that puts it too narrowly, and you can't address that by saying we need STEAM rather than STEM. We need to refocus, I would say, on the sort of the big problems and on the widest variety of liberal arts, not humanities, approaches to the understanding and redress of those problems. And the universities have to stand for that. What's happened, alas, I think, in the history of education is that the liberal arts ideal at the core of collegiate education has simply been swamped by the instrumentalism of both disciplinary education and the utilitarian pressures that have always been present in higher education. Now, how do we get out of this? Hard to know exactly, except I think by focusing on those institutions and those activities that do speak to bigger problems and broader audiences. I have greater hope, for instance, for the development of community colleges and for institutions like Chris's institutions, which is a state liberal arts education. I think that Rutgers needs to be more like the College of New Jersey than the other way around. Is the way I would put it. Now that's not going to be easy, but there are a lot of us who think that, and so that's where these two things come to. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen quickly. It may not happen at all. But I think it depends upon those of us who have that kind of intuition, putting our shoulders to the wheel and our mouths to the microphone to try to make it happen. I'm sorry, that's a long answer.
No, it's a great answer, and I love the way that you combine the two issues, the two questions. It's interesting. I listen to what you're saying about the resiliency of our democracy, and you said your belief in it is an act of faith. I see it as just your sort of reading of history. You're absolutely right. We've had these moments where the Republic has struggled multiple times. And in talking about the role of higher ed and all of that, I'm thinking in particular about how the public humanities might be an outlet for recapturing some of those lost elements of what we understand as being meaningful in a democracy. Could you talk a little bit about the role of the council for the humanities and the public humanities, and maybe remedying some of, the problems that Howard or Dan sees as we move forward?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what you just said is what I think. And after all, one of the roles, and I think one of the most important roles of NEH, of the endowment, is to engage the public, engage the citizenry with the humanities, in the belief that that will enrich not just the political life, but the civic life of the country. So in a way, I think the challenge then is to bring the humanities into civil society, and to make everything we do richer in civic content. And I think that's something we can perhaps talk about later. So the reason why it's particularly important then to have the public humanities, whatever they are, is because we're all agreed, if we agree on nothing else, that can't be traditionally academic. That is to say, it can't be disciplinary. It can't be narrow. We have to find ways of attracting the interest, the attention, and the commitment of a non-academic public. And that's not so easily done. And so to the extent that we have to focus on that, it has, I think, a generative impact on what all of us do, but particularly on what the academics do. Because it's one, you and I can do what we're trained to do in early American history or diplomatic history, fine. We know how to do that. But we're not trained to engage the general public. That is almost unknown, not quite, but almost unknown in the academy. And so that's something we learn by doing.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. That's, after all, what John Dewey told us we ought to be doing in any case. So I think my answer would be that is the virtue of the public humanities, because what we're being asked to do in the public humanities is to figure out how we can communicate to the broadest possible audience on the values and functions of the humanities in a democratic society. It is no help to point to our narrow academic achievements in order to do that. And I think the hardest part of that, and I'll try to conclude with this, is by figuring out how it is we as academics can get higher education to recognize some portion of just that. And I've been talking on that in an undergraduate seminar I'm giving now with my friend Ira Harkavy from the University of Pennsylvania. Ira is the head of the Netter Center at the UPenn, and that center is charged with developing public engagement for the University of Pennsylvania. That's why I'm so delighted that Liz is going to the University of Pennsylvania. And he's done a fantastic job. And his basic answer to that is by engaging the local community. So no, this is not something you do globally or on a large scale. This is something you do locally. It's an old-fashioned 60s idea, after all. All politics is local. And so they have built relationships in Philadelphia and Dubai with local communities, local schools, churches, hospitals, and so forth. But the challenge to him and to anybody who tries to do this is that how do you institutionalize in the University of Pennsylvania these relationships and the sort of the byproduct of that engagement? You really ought to get a National Humanities Medal if you can figure out how to do that. And we don't know, but we have to work at it. So that's what I'm most concerned about now, because I think our universities have gone in both in an elitist direction, but also in an instrumentalist direction. These are different and unrelated things. They're equally destructive, I think, of the larger goals of higher education. And I think those of us in the Public Humanities Committee who are in higher education have a real responsibility to not forget that we've got to change our home base as well as our communities.
Well put. We're going to run out of time in about 5
Okay.
minutes, but I wanted to just open, the floor to anyone who might have a question on this, because this is such an important topic, particularly since we have so many academics on this call. Anyone have any questions, any comments?
I'll throw
Karin?
a quick question out there. Stan, you said something the other day that I found really interesting, which was that with respect to January 6th and Trump and everything that we've seen, the threat of recent years has come not from an idea or an ideology, but from a person who lacks ideas altogether and who's motivated by something very different. Does that change the nature of how we in the public humanities try to combat what we see as the actual rather than the anticipated threat to democracy? Because it turns out it's not a war of different ideas, it's a war of ideas versus something that's not idea-based.
Yeah, well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I don't think so. After all, Trump survived the University of Pennsylvania, and I think the University of Pennsylvania, will never live down the fact they gave him a degree. But I've just said nice things about Penn, so I will say that as well. But no, and there are going to be people like that. The problem here is the problem of populism. And I think this is something that has always been a lurking danger in any democracy. Mm-hmm. It's certainly been a lurking danger in American democracy. And it goes way back. And I mean populism of the Trumpian kind, I don't mean the Granger movement when I talk about this. And that's an assertion, I think, that we need a leader, that leader will speak for the people, and that the big enemy is the elites who have thus far dominated democratic society. So the real threat here is that it's anti-pluralist and anti-elitist. And I think what we as humanists have to be for is democratic elitism. And the way we achieve that is through the broadest education of the public, as well as through the highest education of the most capable people in the society. So yes, I think we have a real role to play in that, but the role is simply doing what we have always done better. And that's where I think the question that Howard put on higher education is really important, because I think one of the things those of us who are academic humanists have to do is to work very hard to get our institutions back to doing the right thing in terms of democratic education.
Yeah. Paul, I wanted to give you a chance to speak.
I just wanted to add to what Stan said. The notion that what we're going through is unique is simply wrong, and that's why we're humanists. This is why we have endowments for the humanities, so that we can remember our history. Compared to the Civil War, this is the ultimate Marxian analysis, right? The history repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, and now it's farce. The insurrection of a year ago sadly took the lives of a couple of people. The insurrection of 150 years ago took the lives of 650,000 people on the battlefields, not to mention other people. And so I do think it's, it's really important to get some perspective. And I also think that we as we as people in the humanities have not done a very good job of reaching out to lots of people around the country. And that's true in the political context, and it's true in the humanities context. And so when I mean, I live in a state now. I am in Philadelphia, and I'm just outside Philadelphia. I'm just outside Philadelphia. A few miles away is the beginning of Pennsylvania, which goes all the way to Pittsburgh. And when I talk to people from that part of the country, they feel completely disconnected to everything we do. And Stan has been in the forefront of trying to change that, but it's so easy for us as academics to hide in our offices and write our books and not interact with real people. And so, when I look at the 2016 election, one person said, "Vote for me, I've earned this." And the other one said, "I'm going to make America great again. And I'm going to bring back to you." Now, he's a liar. He's not going to do that. He didn't do that. But at least we failed ourselves. And I think that's a lesson in history that, we're learning a hard way right now. But I think it's part of what the humanities is all about. And it's why humanities are so desperately important right
Well, there's not time to discuss all of this. I do think one thing Paul says bothers me, though, and I don't agree with it. They are
now. That
people.
won't be the first time you didn't agree with me.
Yeah, that's right. No, but they have ideas. I don't agree with a lot of their ideas, but what we need to do is engage them. And I think they're real ideas. They're not real ideas on our side all the time either, after all. So I think the most important thing that the public humanities movement and NEH have done is to get a lot of us out of our offices, make sure that we are in fact engaging. Much more generally, we have to keep pushing at that. If NEH and if the endowments have done nothing else, they have really done an excellent job of doing that. Even on a small level, what used to be in this council, the Speakers Bureau, was incredibly important. I see Kiki Jameson here, and she got her start in a way in all of this in the Speakers Bureau. I think that's really important. And I don't think we can say enough about that. But finally, let me just say, we sort of passed over something. I think we have to think harder about what both academic organizations, but also the councils and our council have to think about. I think the two most important public institutions in the United States are the public library and the public school. And I think, if you ask me where you're going to put your money, that's where I would like to put my money. And I think that we have a lot of opportunities of that kind to get to people where they live and to be genuinely supportive and to help them open things up. And I think that's the function of the council, and that's the function at its best of NEH. And that is to energize and support those of us who see the big picture and to sort of organize what we do. And all I can say is, thank you to those of you who are carrying the torch. I just don't think anything is more important.
Wow. Thank you very much. I think we couldn't have ended on a better note. The connection to the public libraries and to public education, a call for all of us to remain engaged in public humanities. I particularly like that note about telling academics to get out of their, ivory towers and go and speak with the people. Karin, I want to turn it over to you and thank everyone for showing up on my behalf, but turn it over to Karin.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well to everybody who's with us tonight. I want to thank particularly Stan and Chris for your role on the council, for your role as public humanists, and for being with us and willing to share tonight. I think this was a great conversation. And I want to encourage everybody to join us in a little over a month. On February 15th, we'll be hosting our second of our 50th anniversary events. It will be another really great conversation, this one at 10 o'clock in the morning. So if you're not a night owl, that one's for you. And we'll be talking a little bit about the building of New Jersey's cultural institutions with 3 African-American women who really helped to diversify the stories that we tell in those cultural institutions. So please consider being with us then. And in the meantime, have a wonderful evening, stay warm, stay safe. And if you're not on our mailing list, please send us an email. We would love to have you. Thank you all.